Hello, everyone. This is a lecture for California Labor, and I'm going to focus specifically on the book Making Democracy Matter and one of the central themes, which is political identity. As you can hear, I finally have my voice back, thank God. Just know that there's only one lecture this week because the topic it's gonna be a little bit of a longer lecture, not really long, but just longer. I wanted to honor your time and make sure I didn't give you two really long lectures. So in this lecture, I'm going to take us through sort of this micro level, meaning if you go back to the beginning of our lectures, where I focus on the idea of the individual, right? And then move us slowly to the meso level, which is really about sort of organizations and neighborhoods. And then finally, in the next lecture, going into next week and tying up the book, we'll look at some of the macro level implications of how we understand political identity, political mobilization, and tie it back to sort of the idea of the integrated framework. Because in many ways, Brodkin's work uses the individual narratives of the people written in this, that she writes about in this book, who actually write about themselves in this book. She uses their own voices to create an integrated frame in which they themselves talk about race and class, gender, immigration, sexuality, all as part of their stories and as part of their own experiences with activism. So in some ways, you're getting sort of a micro level view of many of this sort of integrated framework we've talked about since the very beginning. In this lecture, I focus on this idea of political identity in work, and then how we start developing inclusive social justice campaigns. Because really what Brodkin really basically argues is that the immigrant rights activism in the 1990s was this moment of very inclusive social justice campaigns. As I'll go into more next week, this is an assessment that I don't know that I completely agree with. But I would certainly say that the work that was done by numerous activists that are written about in this book pushed the boundaries. They walked into contested territory where they forced other institutions to understand why immigration matters, why race matters, or how you have to rethink what work means. I think what's also very interesting about this book, at least for me on a personal level, is I know about half of the people that were written about in it. So I also know where they've gone since the 1990s and how they continue to do this work and try to instill some of these values and belief systems. And it's still a very sort of central part of their political identity. So I think that there are a couple of really important passages that she frames at the very beginning of the book, which I hope that you caught early on. So when she's talking about political identity, particularly on pages 8 through about 12, she has some very kind of key ways in which that she frames her work and frames it relative to the literature on political identity. She says, activists speak to, through, and for particular constituencies in complex ways, presenting to the public a collective political subject or identity in whose name action makes obvious sense. If you'll remember, a few weeks ago, I introduced the idea of a stakeholder, right? These are synonymous terms. They're talked about a little bit differently, but they're essentially the same thing. These are people who really try to identify a very specific political subject in a way of thinking. Brodkin argues that political identity is more than just labels such as worker or immigrant or unionist. In other words, these labels aren't enough to capture the dynamism of an individual's choice, how they identify on a day-to-day basis. She goes on further to say it's a rich, textured understanding of oneself as a person linked to families, neighborhoods, jobs, schools, and histories in personally meaningful ways, which helps people understand how they must act in order to live meaningful lives. So beyond just this is how I identify, part of what she's getting at here is that these are actions that take on meaning, that help frame who they are. It helps justify and rationalize their actions. It is central to who they see themselves, or how they see themselves relative to the rest of the world. And that when they don't live their life in a way that honors those belief systems, it leads to being, the other side of that is not leading a meaningful life, or not fulfilling what they believe is important. So again, it's important to note that the tonation of her discussion here on political identity is very, very rooted in the individual, right? How an individual feels, how they see themselves relative to the rest of the world, how they see themselves relative to the constituencies that they affiliate with, right? So this is important to note, because this is really how she comes at her work in this book at a very individual level. So oftentimes with political identity, as she's noted there, they try to boil it down to the least common denominator. They try to make it about one issue. This somewhat satirical, or the satirical cartoon that I've pulled up here really kind of gets at trying to get at how popular culture or media, or even sometimes the people around us, try to frame our political identity based on ascribed characteristics, meaning characteristics like, how they perceive your race or your gender, as you'll see here in this particular cartoon. It happens all the time. It probably happens to some of you in the classroom. I know for me, as an Asian American, whenever I was in classes, particularly where there were mostly white students, and I was one of a handful of people of color, or the only Asian in the room, when the topic turned to something like Chinese New Year or Asians, everybody looked at me and expected me to know, or to speak for the race, as they say. I've seen this happen as a teacher, as I've watched other colleagues teach, where they'll be talking about African-American experiences and only look at the one African-American in the room. Granted, this is an online course, and this is sort of odd to talk about in the abstract, but I'm counting on each of you to think back on the moments in which you've experienced this sort of singling out of who you are, and an assumption of what your politics may be based on how you look, whether that's being male or female, being an immigrant or non-immigrant, based on your age or your abilities, all of it, right? So we understand that people make these snap judgments. And at the same time, these aesthetics, these ascribed characteristics don't define what our politics may be, or what our behaviors may be. And I think that's what's really important to think about in terms of political identity, particularly as Brodkin talks about it in the book, is that what she argues is that we need to be much more complex in our thinking. There isn't a one-to-one correlation between one's race and how they vote. There isn't it certainly isn't a causal relationship that, if you're black, you will therefore vote for Obama, right? Or in the case of this particular cartoon, if you're a woman, you will therefore vote for Hillary Clinton, right? So democratic behavior, broadly construed, I'm not talking about a political party here, but democratic behavior, whether that is voting, civic engagement, or activism, is often subject to oversimplification. And so what she begins to draw out here, and what I'm asking you to do in your response papers, is to really nuance this. Go beyond just the simple ascribed characteristics, whether that's age, race, gender, etc., and really start mapping out, how does one come into their political self? How do they get beyond the constructs of race or gender or immigration? How do their many different experiences, which in and of themselves can be contradictory, help build who these individuals are as activists, and how they see themselves relative to their constituents? I think it's important to note that action and purpose is further bolstered by the construction of meaning and action through local cultures. This is again right around page 9 in Brodkin's book. Here, what she's getting at is, when we look at categories like race or gender, right? These are very amorphous. They're not geographically specific. We also know that race means different things in different locations, as does gender, as does race. So many different things take on different meanings in different geographic locations. So here, what she's talking about in terms of local cultures is thinking about how communities, whatever groups that we call community, right, inform who you are as individuals. Now, I think it's important to note that while I made the reference to geography, for some, communities are very geographically driven. They are attached to where you live. These in sort of traditional urban, in traditional literature around urbanism and studies of the city, all the discussions of community were all geographically bounded by what streets you lived on, what neighborhoods you were growing up in, but if you lived a few streets over past a particular boundary, you were in a different community. But other cultural geographers have said, well, you know what? It isn't just about geography. And they introduce this idea of a community of sentiment. And this idea of community of sentiment is exactly what Brodkin is also sort of invoking in a different sort of way. It's this idea that you are linked to a community via your experiences, your memories, your shared histories. So many of us have these communities of sentiments in different ways. Communities of sentiment can be based on be a faith-based affiliation. So I have numerous friends, for example, that it doesn't matter where they lived, that when they go home, whatever place they call home, there's a particular faith-based community that they're always part of. It doesn't matter how long they've been gone from. That faith-based community for them, it isn't just about being there. They'll also invoke that community. They will work with that community via the internet, via Facebook, using other social networking ideas. Communities of sentiment can be, related to a group where you had a very specific shared experience, where it informs who you are. Around the same time period, there was a group of people that I worked with as part of the Immigrant Workers Freedom Ride. And while I don't see many of them very often, I know that whenever we have a chance to talk, whenever we have a chance to sit down, what bonds us together are so many of the things that happened in that 3-week campaign where we went across the country. We know we share very similar values and belief systems, and it's not a matter of time, but it's about these shared experiences. I oftentimes use the example of how, when you think of home, what do you think of? And there are so many different ways in which you define it. So for some of you, now that we're thinking about the holidays, we're coming up on Thanksgiving, some people define home as where their parents are. I go back to my childhood house and I have dinner with my mom or dad or my grandmother. And this is, in many ways how I've thought about it too, like so many other people. But one time I was working with a group of foster youth. And I asked this sort of same question, like, what does home mean to you? And one of the foster youth said to me is, home is wherever my computer's at. And I looked at him and I said, well, what do you mean home is where your computer's at? He says, well, look, I get moved around every month, every 2 months. I have to throw all my stuff into garbage bags, take my school stuff with me to the next foster home. It's like the only way I stay connected with the people who come in and out of my life is via my computer. So home is where my computer's at. As long as I have my computer, I'm okay. As long as I can stay connected and talk to people and be able to sustain the relationships that are important to me, that's what I call home. And so here, when we think about this idea of political identity and this idea of local culture, it is about invoking those experiences and understanding that there are so many ways in which we connect to these different belief systems. Brodkin notes that the various interpretations which are often contested are part of an ideological struggle designed to elicit broader participation in a revolutionary movement. So here's where we're starting to move out of the individual. So you have this group of people with different experiences, with different reasons for organizing, different reasons for being activists. But what makes it bigger? What makes the struggle more revolutionary? How do they connect to one another? How do these social networks work together? How do we know that John DeLauro, for example, would necessarily get along with Liz Sunwell? How do we know that their experiences were compatible and that they could work together to build a movement? How do we know that the work of Joanne Lowe, who worked with the garment workers, A group of people that unions had not necessarily been friendly to historically could work well with an organizer like John DeLora, who was very pro-union, who was an organizer for SEIU. How do we know that there would be consensus? So part of what we know is, one, is that they need to find common ground. They needed to find a way in which this immigrant rights work that they were doing could jibe together. And it doesn't mean that they wouldn't have disagreements. That's what we mean when something's contested. But we also know that when they finally found what they agreed on, they also then worked together in their respective movements to promote a particular set of ideals. And in terms of immigration, it could be a pathway to citizenship, workers' rights, etc. So once they were able to identify their common ground and to develop a very specific campaign and campaign strategy, the next step was then to develop a collective political identity in which more people could associate with it. Because if only one person holds the idea, there's no movement. Part of the key to a collective political identity is being able to bring large groups of people together to back people, to back an idea, a set of ideas, to be able to promote a particular set of values and belief systems. We've seen this play out in different ways, in very dynamic ways, over the past 6 to 8 months. I think one of the most memorable things that we've seen in a long time, for those guys who've been paying attention to Texas, is Wendy Davis, who's now running for governor. Wendy Davis, as a representative in their Congress, protested the anti-abortion laws there. And I'm not going to get into the specifics of pro-life versus pro-choice, but what I want to point out here is the idea of how people's individual political identity became a collective identity. What people began to associate with were, they began to associate with Wendy Davis based on gender, based on belief systems. They began to associate based on how they felt relative to the politics impacting women in Texas. But it wasn't just about women in Texas, it was about women from all over the United States started backing Wendy Davis as well. That's something that she was doing in terms of her advocacy for a woman's right to choose, as well as decrying the sexism that was very implicit and explicit in the ways that she was being treated. People started attaching themselves to this campaign. And so what we begin to do is that's a contested moment, right? When people start to put Wendy Davis down in very sexist ways by how they characterize her as a woman, right? And then there's a pushback, right, saying that's not right to be sexist when you're talking about Wendy Davis. It's not right to characterize her in this way. That pushback, that contestation about what it means to be a woman, what her proper place was, how she should be allowed to act on the congressional floor, right? This is part of what Brodkin talks about as contested and ideological struggle. But the goal here is to push forward an agenda that a large group of people can get behind. So here we're moving from the individual to the collective. So how do we start understanding political identity in everyday life, right? So there are many different components or there are many different components to political identity, and I've listed a few that she highlights throughout the book here. And I'm going to start from the top here at 12 o'clock, right? Personal experiences. She sees this as being very instrumental for how people feel about particular issues, how they make meaning of the world around them. There's social networks. Now, social networks are who we are connected to. Usually our strongest social connections, or our strongest part of our social network is usually our family and the friends that we've known longest, right? But the social network broadens out. It could be people you've worked with, that you've gone to school with, people that you've met through your faith-based community or community organizing. It could also be groups of people that you've met throughout your travels, right? For a social network, all you need to do is look at the friends section of your Facebook page. This shows you how you're connected. And we also know that the strength of those connections can be strong or weak. What we do know, particularly from the book, is the stronger your social connection to people, the more likely they are to influence how you think and how you behave. History. This isn't just about personal experiences, but this is also about sort of a collective history of what have people experienced together. It's about what happens in neighborhoods and cities. It could be histories of disempowerment, right? All of these are a big part of how we begin to think about who we are politically. Your neighborhood, right? What she calls the making of the political self. How you start making decisions about what matters to you. Work, places you call home, privilege, social justice, right? I don't really feel like I need to expand on these too much because she talks about it at length in the book. And I do have the expectation that with each of these, you can begin to see how they factor in to each narrator's sort of discussion of self, right? And so one of the questions I've asked you for this week is to really map out how people think about their political identity. Now, not everybody's going to cover every single one of these categories, but part of the story that she weaves about particular individuals really interweaves a lot of these as a general theme. And so then beyond just the political identity, it's about how then they begin to do what we call civic engagement work. Some people call it activism. Some of us call it civic engagement. There are sort of different ways in which we look at this. I've chosen to talk about it in terms of civic engagement because this is also very central to a lot of the work of what unions do. Thomas Ehrlich defines civic engagement as working to make a difference in the civic life of our communities and developing the combination of knowledge, skills, values, and motivation to make the difference. It means promoting the quality of life in a community through both political and non-political processes. So political processes can be about advocacy work, putting new laws on the books. It can be being part of PTAs and running for school boards. It can be about getting out the vote and encouraging people to vote. It could be lobbying your legislators. Non-political processes could also be about the idea of how we bring our communities together to change the conditions in our communities. So some of you may have participated in these. There's a process called the World Cafes, where different groups or community organizations, or really community members, it's not even organizations, they'll pick different topics to talk about and learn, so they can learn more about themselves, about their community, and how they could help. So they'll talk about issues like what's happening in the school system, or how do I become a more effective parent? How do I help my child be an effective student, right? These don't come across as very political processes, but as a community, for example, let's think about the idea of homework, and your children having to do homework at school. When you do homework, this seems like an apolitical act, but what we begin to see is we also understand that there's a direct correlation between a mother's education and their children's education. The higher a mother's education, it has a strong positive correlation with a child's correlation. So the higher a mother's, sorry, that's all over the place. The higher a mother's education, the higher the education of the child. And so, but that doesn't mean it's deterministic. It doesn't mean that conditions can't change. So particularly within a lot of immigrant communities, and historically also in LA and in poor African American communities, we've seen that high school graduation rates have fluctuated and are relatively low. But that doesn't mean that moms can't also be educators. So what happens in a lot of these community building sessions at these World Cafes is that they really work with people to say, okay, so we want to think about homework as something you do every day. And that there are certain things that you as a parent can do to make sure that your kid is able to succeed in school. Number one is set up an environment in which the child does their homework every day. Second can be community organizations X offer tutoring. So if you can't necessarily help little Susie with her homework, you can bring them there for tutorials on math or on science. So part of it's also giving them access to resources that can then also help them improve their education. and that and that as people work together, let's say that there was that in the school they got rid of some of the science classes that are needed in order to get into college. Parents who've been focusing on, well, what do my kids need to do to get into college, they can then bridge that non-political process with a political one of then advocating to principals, to the school board. You can't get rid of these things. We need this in order to improve high school graduation rates. We need to use these classes in order to get our kids to go to college. So when we talk about civic engagement, it is about both sides, the political and non-political processes. So I think it's a part of the story here is political identity has a complex interplay of numerous experiences that inform the development of an individual's political identity, which I kind of went through already, so I'm being somewhat redundant in the earlier slide. These factors, for me, who my grandparents are, the fact that my parents or grandparents are immigrants, that I come from a working class background, et cetera, et cetera. These are all parts of how I think about who I am. It is also about how I think about my activism, right? It informs what's important to me and what campaigns I decide to work on. Political identity, however, isn't just about this individual. It's about how we finding others that one connects to. So I want to go back to this idea of social networks. I think it's really important for us to really think about connections on multiple levels. Because so often when we talk about our connections, we only talk about the individuals we're connected to. And here, I think part of what is the rich part of the story that Brodkin tells is that the connections occur on multiple levels. So irregardless of, even if you may be Latino and Asian American, you can still find similarities, right? Whether you're young or old, you can find different similarities. These connections can happen around similarity of migration experiences, or, for example, for a lot of communities, being a refugee in your refugee experience. It can be about socioeconomic status, what resources and life chances you had available to you. It can be, particularly when we're talking about unions, it can be about experiences in the labor force. We've talked about this a little bit already with United Farm Workers, right? Is that you had Filipinos, you had Mexicans who were all organizing, and that they had an experience in the labor force where they're being exploited, paid low wages, they're being pit against each other. This is something that connects them. But we also know that their faith community in the United Farm Workers connected them as well. It can be experiences with discrimination, whether that's sexism, racism, homophobia, etc., ableism, that brings people together and moves them towards collective action. It can be about neighborhood and community and the type of work they may want to do to improve communities. Again, part of what's really important here, it's not that it's that they begin to understand what shared values, ideals, and experiences they have. That these conversations, these discussions, these opportunities to really work with one another help facilitate discussions and experiences that allow people to understand how they're connected and what's meaningful to them. Because it's not enough to, if not, in the absence of real relationship building, well, you can't just assume that a group of people will all come together just because they're all women, right? Or because they're all Chinese or they're all Filipino, right? I think we all know that doesn't happen in real life. So part of what she gets at here is the meaning. How do we develop understanding of what's meaningful to each individual? And how do we then elevate and develop relationships that help build sort of these shared values and experiences? And beyond that, it's about also then using those links, those bonds, those relationships to move towards collective mobilization. According to Mahatni, collective mobilization is a transformational approach which empowers marginalized communities to challenge dominance and create changes in their lived situations. Here, again, so you have, let's stay with United Farm Workers. You have shared experience around faith. You have shared experiences around worker exploitation, shared experiences with pesticides in the field and the impact on your health. You have a shared experience of what it means to have left your homeland and come work in the United States. You have shared experiences in terms of so many different things, right? Being mostly male workers in the fields. What collective mobilization does is really about how do these groups start to challenge those structures of dominance, right? Some of that is about banding together. It's acknowledging where differentials in power exist. It's about understanding, well, here's how we were treated at Ranch X, and here's how we were treated in Field X. This is how we're all being treated by the owner of this particular set of fields. It's about then identifying what the problems are, what you have shared in common, and then focusing on how you can create change. Now, in the context of a California labor class, creating change is oftentimes about labor negotiations, about strikes. It's also about using particular strategies and tactics. But here, I think it is really important to know that the core thing that you need to know about collective mobilization is about how do groups, this last part of the sentence, how do you challenge dominance and create change? Now, it's really easy to get into this discussion of political identity without any regards to the fact that there are obstacles, and very real ones, to mobilizations. Obviously, when you want to bring different groups together, there are going to be different perspectives. So earlier when we were talking, we've talked about this earlier in this class, you have differing stakeholder perspectives and investments. For different workers, they may want different things. For different communities, different issues might be more important. For some, we see this play out every day in different communities. For some, they want to improve. For some groups, the most important thing to do is improve schools. For others, it's about changing immigration policy, and for others, it's a living wage. Oftentimes, people cannot see beyond their one issue that's most important to them. So the obstacle, or really the obstacle you need to face, is how do you deal with these different perspectives? Number one. And number two, how do you develop consensus? How do you start developing a collective idea of how we want to move forward? Because one of the things, as someone who does consulting work in the community, one of the things that we talk to communities about is that we spend 80% of our time talking about the 20% we disagree about. All of us have been in those meetings. People will argue and argue and argue, but they won't talk about what they agree on. So part of really the art form of consensus building is really thinking about how do we all come together. We also have different histories, but not just that, we have a lack of understanding of each other's different histories. So, for example, back in the 2000s, with a lot of the home care workers campaigns for SEIU, this was a union that organized Chinese workers, Mexican workers, home care workers, and African American home care workers. Now, when they used to have these, what they call super summits, where they had to have trilingual translation, simultaneous translation. And here, I think what was important to note is that there were times when, for example, one of the examples from that when I was doing these interviews, that they talked, an African American woman was talking about how she grew up in the South and how she grew up cleaning houses and how she was treated, and the response from both one of the Latina home care workers as well as another Chinese home care workers, both of them said, "I didn't realize that was how people were treated. That's how I get treated today." And vice versa for this African American woman, as she listened to the experiences of how these women were being treated by their clients, said the same thing. And so what we often find is that these communities don't often have the tools to speak with one another, but number two, we don't necessarily have an understanding of their different histories. I think it's also important to note, particularly with immigrant communities, there are very adversarial histories and relationships between both individuals and communities. We have to understand, for example, when you look at the African community in Los Angeles, there's both an Ethiopian and an Eritrean community. Now, for those of us who don't understand the history of Eritrea and Ethiopia, those two countries exist because of a civil war, and that civil war divided the country, and I don't have time to go into the full details of it, but we begin to understand that how someone identifies as Eritrean or Ethiopian is very closely connected to a set of politics and history. And so when you have those kind of issues, how do you work around it? When you look at some elderly Asian Americans, for example, people who would have been my grandparents' generation, as someone who's Chinese, they did not like the Japanese because they thought the Japanese as conquerors. So these histories aren't just about the history of what's happening in the United States. It's part of a larger global history, a global history of domination, empire, and war that informs how people think about themselves and how they think about different communities, and that these lead to misunderstandings between different groups. And as a result, unless you have a strong group of people willing to come together to create a shared mission and vision, community or collective mobilization can go into different directions. And this is where, people who've done work on both labor unions and worker centers and social movements will tell you having a lack of shared mission and vision often leads to a failure of a social justice movement and a lack of social change. So really a lot of the hard work, and we talked about this a bit with the United Farm Workers, a lot of the work in social justice movement and creating mobilization is about shared mission and values and vision. So one of the things I want you to think about, and I want you to, this is where I'm going to leave you off going into next week, is, are immigrant rights workers' rights? And I want you to spend some time kind of thinking through that, and that's going to be one of our prompts for next week. Is there overlap between the two? Are there some things that are distinctly immigrant rights, and are there things that are simply just workers' rights? Are there some workers' rights that immigrants can't be part of? Think about that relative to the book, because part of that is the central argument that a lot of these folks are talking about. And we also know that the answer depends on your stakeholder perspective. For some, immigrants represent the loss of jobs, suppression of wages, labor market competition, or racial and ethnic tensions. And for others, immigrants also, working with fellow immigrants is about opportunity. It's about living out the American dream. And so what I'll talk a little bit more, we've already talked about the United Farm Workers, but one of the things I'm going to start tying together in next week's lecture is, I know I gave you some context on African American workers, but part of what I think is really central, particularly to the 1990s moment and the moment we're living in right now, are how do we deal with, within social justice movements, this contested ground that we often find ourselves in between African American workers and immigrant workers. Right? We see this play out. Let me just give you kind of a brief example. With African Americans, immigrants in the hotel industry, there had to be a very concerted campaign by the HERE, the Hotel and Restaurant Workers Union, back in the late 1990s, early 2000s. In order to retain their African American membership, one of the things that they needed to have central to their campaigns was a part of their work had to really focus on making sure that African Americans weren't, quote unquote, in the back of the house. One of the things that they did when they did their industry analysis, what they acknowledged is that that in hotels, hotel management disproportionately put African American workers in spaces where they couldn't be seen. They were in the back of the house, whereas immigrants would be working in the front of the house. Now, this had numerous different implications in both the hotel and restaurant industries. In the restaurant industries, it was a difference between getting tipped and not being tipped. There were wage differentials, right, based on where you were working. And this is the same for when you were working in the kitchens as well. There are huge wage differentials. So then one of the complaints of African American workers was, we aren't given access and opportunity to work in these capacities. And immigrant workers, at the same time, there was some pushback from some who said, well, why should I support African American workers? Does that mean less opportunity for people like me? So this is what I mean by contested ground. And I want you to really think about this idea of worker rights versus immigrant rights. And that's what we're going to think about for next week, particularly at the conclusion of the book.